Hello, it's me again, your graduate historian, here to complete our video review series of AP World History. Again, please keep in mind, these are not meant to be a comprehensive review, but just a quick survey overview of some of the material that is most likely to be on the test. So let's get started because you'll need to sit down, put your seatbelt on. We got a lot of history to cover. Mandatory history quote, just keep in mind that this time period, this lesson time period covers only a century. So there's a lot going on here. All right, the overarching themes, let's just be real. This century, of course, is dominated by the two world wars, World War I, World War II, and of course the attendant Cold War, the breakup of empires and colonies, and finally globalization or not. This is the century of all the isms: nationalism, militarism, fascism, communism, globalization, and tribalism. Okay, mostly isms, but you know what I mean. And of course, ultimately, the question asked by this particular section of the test is going to be, is the world more interconnected or not? Is this a good thing or not? All right, let's begin with World War I. So, as we left the last video, of course, we had the race to build the empires, the spheres of influence that Europe had broken itself into, basically two great alliances. And of course, we now have the impact of technology and military mobilization plans on Europe. So European rivalries with global impacts, the rise of the alliance system. I think people underestimate the impact of technology and military mobilization on the coming of the First World War. All of the major European nations at this time had huge conscript armies with very complicated mobilization plans, right? They actually had, their armies were twice or three times as large when they were fully mobilized. But to fully mobilize, they had to use an extensive network of railroads and telegraphs. These mobilization plans were very inflexible. And once they were set in motion, they were almost impossible to stop. So if a country in Europe started to mobilize its army, there's a pretty fair chance that it was going to go to war. This is the problem that Europe found itself in July of 1914, when the Archduke of Austria was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. The Serbs and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were, of course, enemies for a very long time. And there's some really excellent books written on this topic, of course, that if the Austrians had moved fairly quickly to retaliate for the assassination of the Archduke, it's possible Europe might not have slid into war. But once the Serbs got the Russians involved on their side, once the Austrians got the Germans involved on their side, World War I was all but inevitable, because the entire German military plan was dependent upon defeating the French and then redirecting the entire German army to fight the Russians. So they don't cover it in any detail that I can see in the review guide. I don't know how much time they spend on the book, probably not nearly enough. So what I've done is briefly summarize the 5 years of the war with a simple one-line phrase. So 1914 was the opening offensive. It was the myth of the offensive. The Europeans, of course, had not taken into account the tremendous changes to military weaponry, the rapid-fire magazine-fed rifle, the machine gun, barbed wire, airplanes. They did not understand that in the eternal battle between offense and defense in warfare, the defense had gained a significant advantage with the machine gun and the magazine-fed rifle in 1914. So you had the myth of the offensive. Both sides assumed that they would have a very quick offensive to defeat their enemy. This did not work. What's said about the stalemate of 1950, as all of the European powers mobilized their economies. Remember, I mentioned a couple of lessons ago about Napoleon being the first European leader to really bring about the concept of total warfare. The Europeans in World War I took this to a definite fine art as they mobilized their economies, their people, their banking systems, their empires on a scale really never before seen in history. This led to 1916, the total war, where you saw the great bloodletting offenses of the Verdun, the Somme, the great offenses on the Eastern Front with the Germans, Austrians, and Russians. These offensives, although they killed hundreds and thousands of men, were again inconclusive. And what we saw was the Germans, as they started to feel the pinch of Britain's economic blockade, decided to launch unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, bringing the Americans into the war. At the same time, Lenin brought down, and other revolutionaries brought down the Russian Tsar, and Russia dropped out of the war. So in 1917, you have America in, Russia out. The Americans provided the margin of victory in the West with a 2 million man strong fresh army, leaving by 1918, all of the sides were pretty much exhausted. The French, the British, the Germans, the Russians, except for the Americans. And the Americans provided the margin of victory in the West. But of course, this victory was not lasting, because the Treaty of Versailles was really a peace without a peace. The Treaty of Versailles blamed the entire cause of World War I on the Germans, which of course we now know, now that we've had some excellent histories on it, was not only patently unfair, but was entirely incorrect. The Russians, I think, based on the histories that I've read, bear at least an equally large share of blame for starting the war. But of course, by this time, Russia was in the throes of revolution. The communists were coming to power, and they were going to finally have their chance to give communism a try, but not really. The League of Nations, which came out of the Treaty of Versailles, decided to try to help outlaw war. That, of course, didn't work well, because you're never going to outlaw war. And of course, you had, I think, the most critical event for us in the 21st century was the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, right? The Treaty of Sykes-Picot broke up the Ottoman Empire. The French and British, fighting over the carcass of what was left in the Middle East, created the overly artificial countries of Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Transjordan, and some of the Persian Gulf states, which are still causing us problems a century later. Thank you, Britain and France. I labeled this, and other historians have kind of labeled this, Europe's 30-year war. If you look at the end of World War I with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, the outbreak of World War II in 1929, yeah, that's only 20 years of war, but if you strap on the 5 years of World War I with the 5 years of World War II on the either end, you basically get Europe's 30-year war of the 20th century. You have a peace without a peace. The Treaty of Versailles, somebody once told me in history class, if you're a victor, you have two choices to do with your opponent. You either totally destroy them, as the Romans did to Carthage, or you make peace with them and make them your buddies, as the United States did with Germany and Japan after World War II. The Treaty of Versailles did neither. It did not crush the Germans, it just annoyed them, so to speak. It left them with a great deal of resentment that that the entire war had been totally blamed on them. It left them with a very large debt of reparations, and it left them in a economically depressed state through the early part of the 1920s that the country had only started to recover from when the worldwide Great Depression hit. Now, there's a lot of historians that will debate how much the Depression had a direct or indirect effect on World War II. It certainly didn't help World War II, because it gave rise to fascism in Italy and Germany. And of course, Japan also feeling the effects of not only the Depression, but their own rise to power and desire for an empire on the march. A lot of people, most Americans, of course, consider that World War II began on December 7th, 1941. This, of course, is false. I think most historians, at a minimum, should put World War II back to 1937, when the Japanese invaded China, because that eventually put Japan and the US on a collision course to war. Or if you really wanted to be a purist, you could go back to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, which was the first great act of aggression that showed the utter uselessness of the League of Nations. This, of course, led to World War II. Germany under Adolf Hitler was basically out to exact their revenge for the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler tore up the Treaty of Versailles almost as soon as he became to power, started building up Germany's military, and started on the road to taking revenge and restoring Germany to its greatness. This, of course, was aided and abetted by the gross and negligent appeasement of the French and British governments. However, you do have to kind of keep in mind that Europe was deathly afraid of another conflict such as World War I. Winston Churchill is sort of quoted as saying, I'll paraphrase here a little bit, they had a choice between choosing peace or honor. Before World War II, they tried to choose peace, and they ended up losing the peace and their honor. The appeasement of Germany did not work. The Germans first gobbled up Austria, then gobbled up Czechoslovakia. When they tried to gobble up Poland, the French and the British finally declared war, and World War II erupted in Europe. Interesting fact that's sort of glossed over here, of course, is the Soviets had a huge hand in World War II that, of course, Soviet history has been totally scrubbed to ignore. The German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, Hitler stored powder all over Europe that all it needed was a spark to set off a war. That spark was the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, which not only secured Hitler's eastern flank for the coming war with France and Britain, but it also split Poland between the Germans and the Russians. The Soviets invaded eastern Poland when the Germans had pretty much conquered all of it and took their share of the spoils. The Soviets also took over Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and launched war on Finland. This is conveniently forgotten by most academics in the West because they wouldn't want to cast a bad light on their communist friends. But the Soviets were at least as bad an aggressor as the Germans prior to the Soviet and the German invasion of Russia in 1941. Don't forget that. It might be useful if you want to take a contrarian stance. Of course, the Germans have a new way of warfare, blitzkrieg, which interestingly enough, the Germans never called it blitzkrieg, using, again, new weapons in warfare, the airplane, the tank, the radio, the truck. All of these changed warfare forever. Again, the offensive became dominant over the defensive for the most part, and the huge set-piece, bloody battles that were fought in World War I were pretty much gone because of maneuver and mobility. When the Germans attacked France in 1940, they accomplished in about 6 weeks what they were not able to accomplish in 4 years of fighting in World War I. They conquered France, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Norway, Denmark, all in about 4 months. Britain stands alone, and people don't expect the British to last very long. However, the British do outlast the Germans. And in 1941, we see a truly global war as the Soviets, the Japanese, and the Americans enter. 1942, we'll see, is the Axis high tide. They are operationally successful everywhere in the world, but they're strategically inept. The Axis powers really have no way to win. No matter how good they are strategically and operationally, they're simply not going to conquer America, Russia, and Great Britain. Whatever you see on the television show, Man in the High Castle, notwithstanding. However, the United States takes time to mobilize its tremendous and overwhelming resources. During 1943, the Allies build up and counterattack the peripheries of the high tide of Axis conquest in North Africa, in Italy and the Mediterranean, in the South Pacific, and starting to move through the Central Pacific. You see the tremendous, almost unbelievable mobilization of American economic and military power come to bear. 1944 is, in a real sense, the decisive year of the war. Normandy is invaded. The Russians drive the Germans out of Russia and move deeply into Eastern Europe. Japan's fleet is destroyed. The Philippines are liberated. The US is moving steadily across the Central Pacific. And by the end of the year, the last great German offensive has been turned back, and the Allies are ready to begin the final conquest of Germany and Japan. 1945, of course, sees the final Allied victory. Europe is devastated and divided as the Allies begin the Cold War. In the Pacific, of course, the Japanese have 2 atomic bombs dropped on them before they surrender. The Japanese, of course, significantly are only occupied by the Americans. In the long term, being good for the Japanese, the Russians never occupy, except for a couple of little islands in the north, never occupy Japan proper. Now we move to the Cold War. And again, there's a lot of discussion and arguments about the causes, who was to blame for the Cold War. You can read those in the book. We do see the creation of the United Nations, which has a great deal more authority to try to enforce the peace than the League of Nations ever did. There's a number of other international organizations that begin, and this, of course, is the era of decolonization. Britain, as the leading global empire of the world in the early 20th century, by the middle of the 20th century, is pretty much broke and exhausted after fighting 2 world wars and cannot maintain a large empire. A bipolar world becomes reality. The world basically is divided up into the communist and free world. This, of course, is seen most in the European countries where you have NATO and the Warsaw Pact formed. China becomes communist, still communist, sort of, except they like money, an interesting discussion topic. And of course, we see the rise of nuclear weapons, right? Culminating in probably the greatest chance that humanity ever had of annihilating itself was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. In several places, although we have what is called the Cold War, it does turn hot, so to speak. Korea and Vietnam, of course, for the United States, are 2 of the more significant conflicts of the later 20th century. There are 4 different major wars fought in the Middle East during this time between Israel and the Arab states. And of course, the Russians have their own conflict in Afghanistan. Now, it's interesting reading the AP World History because you sort of get the impression that the Cold War just kind of ended. This, of course, is, I think, any historians that really look at the facts, patent nonsense. The Cold War ended after a period of unsuccessful détente brought about after the Vietnam War, not just because the Soviet Union and communism was economically unviable and a contradiction, but because of the moral failings of communism and the rise of what I like to call the Holy Trinity: Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and most importantly, Pope John Paul III. Now, you will never see an AP history book acknowledge the critical role that John Paul and the Catholic Church made in defeating communism. But if you read any serious book on the Solidarity Movement, which is acknowledged in the book here, and the relationship of the Solidarity Movement to the Catholic Church, to the Pope, you will find that the Pope pretty much took the Soviets head on, which is why they tried to assassinate him, and defeated them morally by showing the people, first of Poland and then the rest of Europe, that communism was a moral failure as well as an economic failure. There were, of course, many new nations in Africa. The end of the European empires brought tremendous change and not a small amount of chaos and bloodshed as ethnic genocides and religious conflicts raged across Africa, Asia, some sections of Latin America. And of course, Latin America had been decolonized much earlier, so they were a little more immune to the colonization conflicts going on in Africa and Asia. Of course, the worst of these was the rise and fall of apartheid in South Africa and the former country of Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Of course, if you go around the world, the Middle East was messy. As I mentioned, the creation of Israel spawned, I should say, 4 major wars in 1948, 1956, 1967, and 1973. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 with the fall of the Shah and the rise of radical Shia Islamic extremism, followed by the Iran-Iraq War, of course, continue to resonate throughout the Middle East. The Middle East gets messier and remains messier with the rise of international terrorism, and of course, what I like to call America's 30 Years' War. This is the almost continuous period of conflict that the United States has been in since about the mid-1980s to present, in the Persian Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, pick a spot. And of course, this section would not be complete without globalization, the rise of China and India as economic powers, new global governance and organizations, oftentimes trying to supplant national governments, and the spreading of ideas and popular culture, I think, is probably the most remarkable change with the internet, social media, you know what I mean, right? But the question then is, are all of these necessarily good? There are, of course, have been remarkable changes to the environment in terms of energy, food and water production, and the impact or potential impact of climate change on food supplies, water supplies, energy, pollution, all of these. I would expect these would be fair game for a question. And of course, the technological change. As I said, the 18th century and the 19th century saw what was for them a remarkable change of new inventions. This, of course, is only accelerated in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as we have the microchip revolution, global connectivity, Wikipedia, Google, all the things, right? You can now literally control the entire sum of mankind's knowledge in a little device. And what do? Watch cat videos and puppy videos, right? But these have come at a cost of social and cultural changes. And there's always the question of a convergence of cultures. And this has caused not a small amount of angst among very traditional cultures, such as Islamic cultures or cultures in the Indian subcontinent or even Asia, where they're not necessarily in favor of the spread of, let's just say, Western thoughts, particularly about women's rights, other rights that may not be universally accepted, and just the general, I think the book calls it the McDonaldization of the globe. You can literally pretty much go to every country in the world, almost, certainly Europe and Asia, and find McDonald's. Some of the stuff there I would not eat because I don't think that that's meat in that Big Mac, just saying. But you see where you have not only a battle of ideas going on the internet these days, but a battle of cultures and a battle of cultural superiority. And this is only likely going to continue. Last, we come to terms and conditions. There would probably be 4 pages of these if I chose to put them all here. Again, no people, not a lot of dates, but I think some of the bigger terms here, particularly looking at the Bolsheviks, fascism, totalitarianism, appeasement, the effects of the Great Leap Forward in China. Again, a lot of people don't really realize that Mao and Stalin killed more of their own people than Hitler did, killed more people of their own people than Hitler did even in the Holocaust. People don't realize that. Glasnost, Perestroika, the various treaties that have come about, GATT, NAFTA, right? And of course, don't forget the PLO, the Viet Minh, and the Viet Cong. Lots of terms and conditions for this particular section. This is going to be a ripe area for document-based questions, I think, short answer questions, long essay questions, all of it. So this concludes the final video for our review of AP World History. Again, this is using the 2020 text, which I assume they will continue to use into the next school year. It is, again, not intended to be a comprehensive review of everything, but a quick survey to hopefully help fill in your own particular study habits. Again, I do highly recommend that you get a study guide and do all of the practice tests, not only to help refresh your memory, but to get used to seeing the test, pacing yourself in the test, getting used to working with documents, and again, getting used to working with an outline, topic sentence, paragraph structure, and writing an essay. I hope these have been useful. Thank you for your time.